In the lavish city of Logos, wealth didn't just live, it breathed. The shimmering lights of towering skyscrapers cast long shadows on the streets below, where luxury cars zoomed by like metallic sharks in a sea of gold. Everything about the city whispered success. Yet, even in its opulence, there was a man whose heart was about to break. Jackson Ikenna, a name that echoed through the halls of power, a billionaire CEO whose life seemed like a well-oiled machine. On the surface, he had it all: money, fame, luxury, and women. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the man who had conquered every business deal, every market, every challenge, was about to face a crisis that no amount of money could fix. Inside his mansion, the air was filled with the soft hum of jazz music. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling like silent witnesses to the wealth that surrounded them. Jackson stood in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting his tailored suit, his face etched with something unfamiliar. Unease. "I don't get it," he muttered under his breath. "Why does this dinner feel like more than just another business meeting?" Behind him, his personal assistant, Mesha, spoke softly, almost cautiously. "Sir, perhaps it's not the dinner, but the person you're bringing with you." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Since when did you become a relationship expert?" Mesha shrugged. "Since Madam started lying with such confidence." Jackson's jaw tightened. The remark hit harder than he cared to admit, but he shook it off. He picked up his phone, dialing her number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. And then Alice answered. "No, hey, baby." Jackson's voice was smooth, but there was a hint of tiredness. "Are you ready? I want you to come with me to this business dinner." There was a long pause. A pause that felt too long, too filled with unsaid words. "I'm not around," Alice replied quickly. Her voice was strangely high-pitched. "I traveled. Family stuff." Jackson frowned. "Traveled? You didn't tell me." "I had to go urgently." Alice's voice wavered. "Family stuff. I'll talk to you later." Jackson nodded, though she couldn't see him. He felt a pang in his chest, but he forced a smile. "All right, take care." "Yeah, bye." The call ended. Mecha, who had been pretending not to listen, turned slowly. "Sir," he said quietly, but the look on Jackson's face said everything. "I didn't say anything," Mecha began. But Jackson raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't need to hear it," Jackson replied dryly, slipping his phone into his pocket. He sighed. "Let's go. Business doesn't wait for heartbreak." But as they drove toward the hotel, Jackson's mind raced. Something didn't sit right. Was it just a business dinner, or was there something more to Alice's sudden disappearance? The luxury hotel glittered like a beacon of excess as Jackson stepped out of his car. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, the laughter of the wealthy mingling in the air. Jackson, his face a mask of composure, walked toward the entrance, but his steps faltered when he saw her. Alice. She was standing at the reception desk, laughing. But it wasn't with him. Her head tilted slightly, that same familiar way he had once adored, but now it was directed toward another man. His hand rested casually on her waist. Time seemed to stop. Jackson blinked, his heart racing. Was he seeing things? He blinked again. No. It was real. Very real. Alice turned her head, her eyes locking with his. Her smile faded. The man beside her frowned. "Babe, what's wrong?" he asked. Jackson's steps were slow, deliberate, as he walked toward them. Each step seemed to echo in his mind, a quiet warning, a dangerous warning. "Who is this?" the man asked, stepping forward. His voice was firm. Jackson's eyes flicked from Alice to the man and then back to Alice. His voice was cold. "The man you lied to?" Alice's voice trembled. "Jackson, please. It's not what you think." Jackson let out a small, bitter laugh. "Really? Because it looks exactly like what I think." The man's hand slowly moved from Alice's waist, sensing the tension in the air. Jackson's gaze didn't waver. "You said you weren't around. I guess you were right. You're just not around me." Alice's eyes widened, panic creeping in. "Jackson, please, let me explain." Jackson's posture didn't change, but his lips curled into a dangerous smile. "Enjoy yourself," he said quietly, before turning and walking away. At the dinner table, the conversation around him was lively, full of wealthy businessmen discussing contracts, investments, and opportunities. But Jackson, surrounded by men whose wealth seemed to match his own, felt empty. "Mr. Ikenna, what do you think about the deal?" one of them asked. Jackson nodded slowly. "It's profitable," he said. "Exactly," the man responded, leaning in. "But—" Jackson's voice grew colder. "Only if loyalty exists. And from what I've seen tonight, a loyalty is rare." The room went silent. No one understood what he meant, but his tone, cold enough to freeze the air in the room, said everything. Later that night, back in his mansion, Jackson sat alone in his room, his mind replaying the events over and over again. He stared at his phone, Alice's name still saved in his contacts under "My Peace." He laughed bitterly. "Peace," he whispered to himself. "You gave me war." The silence in Jackson's mansion was suffocating. The kind of silence that only comes after something monumental breaks. Something irreparable. Jackson lay on his bed, staring up at the ceiling. The golden chandeliers, the expensive furniture, the cold perfection of his mansion. None of it mattered anymore. He could almost hear Alice's voice, still fresh in his mind. "I traveled. Family stuff. Family stuff," he whispered bitterly. That's what she calls it now. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. He stared at it for a long moment before he reached over and picked it up. Alice had sent him a text. It was short. Too short. "Jackson, I'm sorry. We need to talk. We need to talk." That phrase used to mean something. Now it felt like the echo of a lie. Jackson didn't reply. He couldn't. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he set the phone back down. Don't miss out on the next twist in this incredible story. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss an update. If you enjoyed this journey, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Whether it's your city or country. Your thoughts mean the world to us, and if this story hit home, give us a thumbs up. Let's make this community stronger with your voice. Loyalty. That's what his grandfather had always talked about. He'd raised Jackson with the belief that loyalty was the foundation of everything. No amount of wealth, no matter how much power or influence you gained, could ever replace loyalty. And yet, here he was, betrayed by the one person he trusted most. Alice, the woman who had once promised him her love, her loyalty. Now, she was nothing more than a stranger in his life. The weight of the betrayal pressed down on him, but it wasn't just Alice. It was the world he had built. The walls of his mansion seemed to close in around him, each piece of luxury a reminder that his life had become nothing more than a hollow shell of what he truly wanted. A sharp knock at the door broke his thoughts. Mecha stepped in, his face serious, his voice low. "Sir, there's a call from the office. It's urgent." Jackson sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair. Business as usual, right on time. "Put it through," he replied, his voice flat. The call came in, and Jackson's assistant on the other end began rattling off numbers, figures, and promises of massive profits. Jackson barely heard him. His mind was still trapped in that hotel lobby, staring at Alice, watching her laugh with another man. The man who had replaced him in her life. "Sir?" Mecha's voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. Jackson blinked, his eyes momentarily clearing. "What?" "The deal. Are we moving forward with it?" Jackson took a deep breath, adjusting his suit as if he were preparing for battle. He had worked too hard to let everything fall apart now. He couldn't just walk away. He had to keep going. For his company, for his legacy. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, though it felt like a lie. "Move forward." As the call ended, Jackson's gaze drifted to the window, his thoughts turning inward once more. The city of Logos glittered beneath him, a sprawling metropolis full of ambition and greed. It had always been a place where anything was possible, as long as you had the money to make it happen. But now, he realized, it had become his prison. The phone buzzed again, this time an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" His voice was colder than he intended. A woman's voice came through the line. It was Alice. "Jackson, please, we need to talk. This is tearing me apart." He stood up, pacing. His breath quickened as anger bubbled to the surface. Tearing me apart? After everything she'd done? After the lies? He didn't need her apology. He didn't need her at all. Don't call me again," he snapped, ending the call before she could say another word. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a heavy stone. He had built his life around this woman, around the idea of loyalty. But now, it was time to walk away. Not just from Alice, but from the entire life he had known. Jackson grabbed his phone once more and typed a message to Mecha. "Cancel all meetings. I'm leaving for a while. It's time to make some changes." Without another word, he walked toward his wardrobe. He passed the designer suits, the silk ties, the carefully crafted shoes. But he didn't pause. His eyes fell on a simple, worn jacket, the one his grandfather had worn in the fields when Jackson was a child. It was a far cry from the suits he was used to. But it felt right. It felt like an escape. He changed quickly, discarding the expensive clothes that had once defined him. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. Gone was the polished billionaire CEO. In his place stood a man running from everything he thought he knew. Jackson grabbed a small bag, throwing a few essentials inside, and walked toward the door. He paused, taking one last look at his mansion, the life he had built. "Money can't fix this one," he muttered to himself before stepping into the night. The cold air hit him immediately, a sharp contrast to the warmth of his mansion. He walked to his car, his mind racing with questions. Where would he go? What would he do? He had no answers, but there was one thing he knew for sure. The man he had been was dead. Now he was someone else, and someone who had to find out who he really was. As Jackson drove away from his mansion, he didn't know what was ahead. But one thing was clear. He was heading toward something much bigger than he ever expected. A new life, a new beginning, or perhaps something much more dangerous. The world outside was unfamiliar. Jackson's car sped down the winding roads, his hands gripping the wheel with a tension he hadn't felt in years. He was leaving behind the comforts of his billionaire life. The penthouses, the meetings, the handshakes that sealed his success. And heading into a world that was raw, unrefined, and real. The night air outside felt different. There was a sense of freedom in it, a sense of possibility. But with that freedom came fear, uncertainty, and the nagging thought. What had he gotten himself into? Jackson had driven for hours, away from the city that had made him a king, but also broken him. The road seemed endless, stretching far into the horizon. Every mile felt like a mile away from everything he had known, everything he had built. He thought he'd be escaping the pain, but instead, he felt it more acutely. The city lights had long since faded, and now only darkness surrounded him. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't look at it. Not now. He couldn't deal with Alice's words, her pleas. Not when he was finally starting to breathe again. The car swerved slightly as Jackson's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. It was then he saw her. The girl. She appeared out of nowhere, her silhouette outlined against the dim glow of his headlights. A basket perched on her head, her clothes simple and weathered, but her posture strong, like someone who carried the weight of the world with no hesitation. Her steps were confident, yet carefree. Jackson's foot eased off the accelerator. What is she doing out here? He watched her walk along the side of the road, her presence oddly comforting in its simplicity. And then, as if guided by instinct, Jackson slowed the car to a stop beside her. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't even glance at him as he lowered the window. Jackson wasn't sure why he did it, but he called out to her. "Hey, do you need a ride?" She stopped walking and turned her head, her eyes sharp but not unkind. She studied him for a moment, her gaze lingering on his unfamiliar car, his foreign appearance. "No thanks," she replied, her voice firm, yet oddly playful. "I'm not desperate." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Desperate? I'm just offering you a ride." The girl chuckled, an effortless sound that caught Jackson off guard. "People like you don't offer rides. People like you are trying to get something in return." Jackson hesitated, taken aback. He hadn't expected that response. His wealth, his status, his power. They had always made him the one to offer, to control. This girl, this stranger, had turned his world on its head in a single sentence. "I'm not asking for anything," Jackson said, his voice quieter now. "Just trying to be helpful." She finally looked at him, her eyes meeting his with a level of clarity that sent a shiver down his spine. She tilted her head slightly, as if assessing him. "All right then," she said, her voice light. "But it's a long road. You'll be better off getting some rest." Jackson stared at her for a moment, unsure why she had such a calming effect on him. Perhaps it was the simplicity of her life, the fact that she wasn't burdened by the complexities of wealth, of status, of expectations. She was just living. With a small nod, he rolled the window back up and pressed the accelerator. The car jerked forward, the engine roaring to life. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, catching sight of her as she walked back into the shadows, her silhouette disappearing just as suddenly as it had appeared. Jackson let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. But there was something about her presence, about her quiet confidence, that lingered in his mind. The rest of the night passed in a blur of empty roads and thoughts that refused to quiet. As dawn began to break, the world around him started to shift. The pain, the betrayal, and the questions, everything began to feel distant, like a dream he was slowly waking from. He had driven far enough. The small village that lay ahead was a far cry from the luxury of Logos. There were no skyscrapers, no polished glass windows, no glittering lights. Just dirt roads, small houses, and people whose lives didn't revolve around stock prices and board meetings. Jackson pulled up to a small, run-down house on the outskirts of the village. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the landscape. He stepped out of the car and took in the quiet beauty of the place. This was his new reality. No high-rise buildings, no crowded city streets, just land. Simple, untouched, and healing. For the first time in weeks, Jackson allowed himself to breathe. This wasn't the life he had planned, but perhaps it was exactly the life he needed. Before he could turn to head inside, he heard a voice call out from behind him. "Hey!" He spun around, his heart skipping a beat. It was her again, the girl from the road. She was standing near a tree, watching him with the same level gaze as before. "I thought you weren't desperate," Jackson said, a half smile tugging at the corners of his lips. She grinned, a flash of mischief in her eyes. "I'm not. But if you're staying here, I might need to warn you about the goats." "The goats?" Jackson frowned. "They're loud," she said, the corners of her mouth curling upward. "And they don't give a damn about personal space." Jackson laughed, the sound genuine this time. The tension he had carried with him for so long seemed to melt away in that moment. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. The girl's smile faded as something caught her attention. "You should probably check on your luggage," she said, pointing to his car. "Seems like your goat alarm is already going off." Jackson turned toward the car, his eyes narrowing. In the back seat, something was moving, something that didn't belong there. Jackson stood outside, the morning sun warming his face as he stared at the small house in front of him. The village was quiet, almost eerily so, but there was a peacefulness in the air that he hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of the city, the constant rush, the deals, the betrayals, seemed so distant here. In the village, there were no expectations, no pressure, just life, real life. But the quiet didn't last long. As Jackson walked toward the house, his footsteps slow and deliberate, he heard a loud, a persistent noise from the side of the road. He turned his head, and there they were. Goats. Dozens of them, bleating loudly as they grazed near the edge of the dirt road. Some were nibbling on scraps of grass, while others bumped against each other in a chaotic dance of hunger and competition. For a moment, Jackson just stood there, watching them. He had never been around animals like this before. Certainly never in such close proximity. But the goats weren't the only thing that caught his attention. The girl, the one he had seen on the road earlier, was standing nearby, hands on her hips, watching him with an amused smile on her face. "You weren't kidding," Jackson said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "They really don't give a damn." She laughed, a loud, carefree sound that filled the space around them. "I told you," she said, giving one of the goats a playful shove. "You're in their world now. They own the land, not you." Jackson couldn't help but laugh along with her. The sound felt strange coming from him, but for the first time in a long time, it felt real. This wasn't just a fleeting laugh to mask his pain. This was genuine. And it made him feel something he hadn't felt in a while, connection. "Well, I guess I'll need to get used to it," Jackson said, adjusting his jacket. "I came here to escape, not to get overrun by livestock." She grinned. "You'll get the hang of it. If you plan to stay here, you'll have to learn to coexist." Jackson raised an eyebrow, a hint of challenge in his voice. "Coexist with goats?" "Why not?" she shot back. "They're good company if you know how to handle them. But I warn you, they don't care about your status. And they care about food. Jackson was about to respond when he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. He turned, his senses on alert. A man was walking toward him, tall with a broad chest and an easy smile. He had a farmer's gait, relaxed but purposeful. He wore simple clothes, a faded shirt, and worn boots that had clearly seen their fair share of miles. The man stopped a few feet away, eyeing Jackson with curiosity. "New in town?" he asked, his voice deep and rough. Jackson nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Just passing through," he said. The man eyed him for a moment longer before his gaze shifted to the goats. "I see you've met the locals." Jackson smirked. "They're something. They're goats. What did you expect?" the man said, his grin widening. He turned to the girl, who was still standing nearby. Is he going to be another city boy who thinks he can change the village? The girl laughed again, a sound that seemed to carry across the landscape. "He's not like the others. He's different." The man raised an eyebrow. "We'll see about that." He paused, looking Jackson over one more time. "Name's Cheek. I own the farm a few miles from here. You planning on staying long?" Jackson hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, he wasn't sure what he was doing. He had come here to escape the life he had built, to try and heal from the betrayal. But now that he was here, things didn't seem so simple anymore. His mind kept drifting back to the city, the deals, the luxury. But here, he felt like a stranger. "I don't know," Jackson finally said. "I guess I'm still figuring things out." Cheek studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a nod, he extended a hand. "Well, if you're sticking around, you might as well start learning how to work the land, if you're serious about it." Jackson hesitated for just a second, then took the man's hand, shaking it firmly. "I'm serious." As Cheeky walked off, the girl turned to Jackson, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "You're in for it now," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Learning how to work this land isn't as easy as it looks. You'll break a sweat for sure." Jackson smiled, his gaze following Cheek as he disappeared down the road. "I've got nothing else to do," he said quietly. "Might as well get to work." Just as Jackson was about to turn and walk toward the house, a sudden sound, louder than the bleating of the goats, echoed through the village. A rumbling noise, but followed by the unmistakable sound of engines. Jackson turned sharply, his heart skipping a beat. In the distance, he saw a convoy of black SUVs speeding toward the village. Jackson stood frozen, his eyes locked on the approaching convoy. The dust from the dirt road swirled in the air, kicked up by the powerful engines of the black SUVs that barreled toward the village. His heart raced, the familiar sense of powerlessness creeping back into his chest. He had only just started to breathe freely here, in this quiet, simple place, away from the chaos of Logos. And now, this interruption. The convoy was unmistakable. There was no mistaking the blacked-out windows, the sleek lines of the vehicles, or the air of authority they carried. This wasn't just any convoy. This was his convoy. Jackson's mind flashed back to the city, to the boardrooms, to the people he used to command. The wealth, the power, the control. It had all come with a price. The kind of price that still followed him even here, in this peaceful village. His fingers tightened around the strap of his bag, the weight of his decision to leave his old life behind suddenly feeling much heavier. "Looks like the past found you?" the girl said, her voice cutting through the tension. She stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the convoy approach with a mix of curiosity and caution. Jackson didn't answer right away. He watched the SUVs draw closer, his mind spinning. Why were they here? The city seemed so far away, but somehow it was right on his doorstep now. The convoy came to a stop in the village square, dust settling around the vehicles like a thick cloud. The first door opened, and a tall man stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his demeanor confident, but there was something about him that seemed too familiar. Jackson felt a cold chill run down his spine. This wasn't just someone from the business world. This was someone who knew him well. The man scanned the village with sharp eyes, his gaze finally landing on Jackson. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Jackson's stomach tightened, his breath catching in his chest. "Jackson Ikenna," the man called, his voice loud enough for everyone in the village to hear. "We've been looking for you." Jackson's body tensed, but he didn't move. "Looking for me?" The words hit him like a blow. He had left Logos, left everything behind. Yet, it seemed his past had come with him, ready to drag him back into a world he had tried to escape. And the man took a few steps toward him, his shoes crunching on the gravel. Jackson stood his ground, not wanting to show any weakness, but his heart was pounding in his chest. "John," Jackson finally said, his voice low but steady. "What the hell are you doing here?" John, his old business partner, the man who had once shared the highest peaks of power with him in Logos, smiled coldly. "I could ask you the same thing. What is a billionaire CEO doing playing farmer?" His eyes flicked over Jackson's simple clothes, a knowing smirk on his lips. "I'm not playing anything," Jackson replied, his voice tight. "I left that life behind." John's smile faded, replaced by a sharp, calculating look. "You think you can just disappear? You think you can run away from all of this?" He gestured around, as if taking in the entire village. "From the money, the power, the business." Jackson's pulse quickened. He knew where this was going. John had always been ambitious, always hungry for more. He wasn't here to have a friendly chat about old times. He was here for something, and Jackson wasn't sure he could afford to give it to him. John took another step forward, lowering his voice so only Jackson could hear. "We need you back, Jackson. You can't just vanish. The deals, the companies, everything is falling apart without you." Jackson shook his head, taking a step back. "I'm not coming back, John. I'm done with that life. I've made my choice." "You don't get to make choices anymore," John said, his voice turning cold. "Not when the empire we built is on the line." Jackson felt his chest tighten. The world he had tried so hard to escape from was creeping back into his life, and clawing at him with promises of power and wealth. But the price of returning to it was everything he had just started to find here. His gaze shifted to the girl. Ngozi, he remembered her name now. She was standing by the side, watching the exchange with a mix of confusion and curiosity. "This is none of your business," Jackson said to her, trying to block out the pressure from John's words. "You don't need to get involved." Ngozi raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't planning on it," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I'm curious. Do you think these people really care about you? Or do they just want what they can take from you?" Jackson's mind raced. She was right. He had spent so much of his life surrounded by people who only saw him as a commodity, as a means to an end. Now, out here in the village, with her, it was different. And she saw him, not as a CEO, but as a man. And it terrified him. John was still talking, but Jackson wasn't really listening anymore. His thoughts were on the girl, on the village, on the life he had started to build here. He had come here to escape everything, everything. But now it was all threatening to come crashing back in. And the worst part? He didn't know if he could stop it. Jackson took a deep breath, his hand clenching around the strap of his bag. "I'm not coming back, John. I'm done." But just as the words left his mouth, the sound of more cars approaching filled the air. A second convoy. Who was coming now? The rumble of the second convoy grew louder, the ground shaking with each passing second. Jackson turned, his heart pounding in his chest. He had barely begun to settle into this new life. This life where nothing mattered except the quiet simplicity of the village. But now, it felt as though the world he had left behind was storming back in full force. The first convoy, John and his crew, had already cast a shadow over Jackson's sense of peace. But this second convoy was a sign of something more. The tension in the air was thick, and Jackson could feel it pressing down on him like a weight. John's eyes narrowed as he saw the second set of vehicles approaching. He stepped forward, his voice cold and calculated. "You think you can escape this, Jackson? You really think you can run away and hide in some village?" Jackson didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze flicked over to Ngozi, who was still standing by his side. She looked between him and John, her face unreadable. "I'm not running away," Jackson said, his voice steady, though his insides were anything but calm. "I'm choosing something different. I'm done with all of it." John's laugh was bitter. "Done? You think you can just choose to walk away from everything you built? From the empire you created?" "I'm not interested in your empire anymore," Jackson said, taking a step back, his eyes hardening. "You and your empire can stay in the past. I'm moving forward. Without you." John's face twisted with anger. But before he could speak, the second convoy arrived, pulling up in front of the small village. The cars came to a sudden halt, their engines rumbling as the doors opened one by one. Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. These weren't just any business associates. These were the ones who ran the shadows. The ones who had always been behind the scenes, pulling strings and making deals that were never seen by the public eye. They were the real power in Logos. From the first SUV, a tall, imposing figure stepped out. Jackson's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the man instantly. Victor Blackwood. The last person he had expected, or wanted, to see. Victor was the one who had mentored Jackson early in his career, guiding him through the rough world of business and power. But that mentorship had always come with a price. Victor had expected loyalty in return. And when Jackson had started to question the costs of that loyalty, everything had fallen apart. "Jackson." Victor's voice was low, almost a whisper. But it carried authority. His eyes locked with Jackson's, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The weight of history, of everything Jackson had tried to escape, hung in the air like a dark cloud. "You've made quite the spectacle of yourself," Victor said, his tone laced with disdain. "Running away to a village, hiding from your responsibilities. Your empire is falling apart, and now you think you can just wash your hands of it." Jackson felt the pressure mounting. He had faced powerful men before, men who had tried to control him, to manipulate him. But Victor Blackwood was different. Victor didn't just use power. He embodied it. And Jackson had always been drawn to that power, until he realized it was a prison. "I'm not your puppet anymore, Victor," Jackson said, his voice steady but sharp. "I'm done with everything you've built. I don't owe you anything." Victor stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "East, you think you have a choice? You think you can just walk away from the deals, the money, the power?" He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "There's no escape from this world, Jackson. Not for someone like you." Jackson's gaze hardened. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I can't escape it. But I'm not playing by your rules anymore." A long silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Ngozi stood off to the side, her arms crossed, watching the exchange with interest, though Jackson couldn't tell if she was worried or simply amused. Victor's gaze shifted from Jackson to Ngozi. "And who is this?" he asked, his voice dripping with curiosity. Jackson stepped in front of her, instinctively shielding her from the weight of Victor's stare. "None of your business." Victor smirked. "I see. You've found yourself a new distraction. Haven't you, Jackson?" Jackson didn't respond. He didn't need to. The way Victor spoke, like he owned everything, like he could take whatever he wanted, was a reminder of why he had left that world behind in the first place. Victor took a step back, his smile widening. "You'll come back eventually. They always do. No one escapes their true nature." With a final glance, Victor turned and walked toward the convoy. John followed closely behind, but Jackson didn't let his gaze waver. The convoy, the men in it, were symbols of the life he had left behind. They were shadows that had followed him for far too long, and they were not going to pull him back into the darkness. As the vehicles pulled away, Jackson let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The weight on his shoulders lightened, but it wasn't over. And it wasn't over by a long shot. Ngozi stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "They'll be back. They always are." Jackson looked at her, his eyes tired but resolute. "I don't care if they come back. I'm not going anywhere." Ngozi tilted her head, a thoughtful look crossing her face. "You're starting to sound like a man who's really trying to escape." Jackson smiled wryly. "I'm not trying to escape, Ngozi. I'm choosing to be here." Just as Jackson turned to walk back toward the house, his phone buzzed again. He picked it up, glancing at the screen. A message. "We need to talk. I'm not letting you go this easily." Jackson's heart dropped. It was from Alice. Jackson stood motionless in the quiet of the village, the dust from the departing convoy still hanging in the air. His mind raced, thoughts tumbling over each other in a chaotic storm. The city, his empire, his past. Everything seemed to be closing in on him again, despite his best efforts to leave it behind. The faint echo of the message from Alice lingered in his mind, like a haunting refrain. "We need to talk. I'm not letting you go this easily." He stared down at the phone in his hand. It wasn't just a message. It was a promise. A promise that she wasn't done with him, that she wouldn't let him walk away without a fight. He had always known that leaving his old life would come with consequences. But he had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the silence of the village would shield him from those consequences. But there were no such shields in life. And no matter how far he ran, the past always had a way of catching up. Jackson closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. His fingers hovered over the screen, but he didn't press the call button. Not yet. Instead, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned toward the small, run-down house in front of him. The village around him had once felt like an escape, a refuge from the glitz and glamour of his former life. But now, it felt like a cage, albeit one of his own making. He had come here to heal, to find peace, but the ghosts of his past were relentless, following him even to the ends of the earth. Jackson, The voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to find Ngozi standing behind him, watching him closely. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were sharp, knowing. She had seen the way he had reacted to the message, the way the weight of his past seemed to settle on his shoulders once again. "You're not free, are you?" she asked softly. Jackson's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, taking in the calmness in her eyes. She wasn't judging him. She wasn't asking him to stay or go. She was simply observing, waiting for him to make the next move. "None of us are ever truly free," Jackson finally said, his voice low. "Not really." Ngozi nodded, as though she understood exactly what he meant. "The past has a way of sticking to us, doesn't it?" "Yeah," Jackson replied, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "No matter how far you run, it always catches up." She stepped closer, her footsteps soft on the dirt road. "And what do you plan to do about it?" Jackson turned his head to meet her eyes. The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but powerful. What was he going to do? His whole life had been about control, about running the show. But now he felt like a spectator, watching his own story unfold, unable to steer it in the direction he wanted. "I don't know," he admitted, the weight of the uncertainty heavy in his chest. "I thought I could just leave it all behind. But it's not that easy. It's never that easy." Ngozi watched him for a moment before speaking again. "You're not the first person to run from something, Jackson. And you won't be the last. But the question is, what do you want now? What kind of life do you want to live?" Jackson looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time, he realized that she wasn't just a distraction, a village girl with too much to say. She was a mirror, showing him the parts of himself he'd been too afraid to face. She was raw, unfiltered, and then perhaps that was exactly what he needed to see. "I want something real," he said, his voice quieter now, as if speaking the words aloud made them feel more tangible. "Something that's not built on lies or empty promises. Something that's not controlled by power or money." Ngozi gave a small smile, the first real smile Jackson had seen from her in a while. "Then you're already halfway there." He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You make it sound so easy." "Because it is," she replied. "We make things complicated when they don't need to be. You can't control everything. You can't always run from your past. But you can choose how you deal with it. You can choose what kind of life you want to build now." Jackson's mind churned as her words settled over him. Choose? That was the key. For the first time in a long time, he realized that he did have a choice. He wasn't a puppet, controlled by the strings of his past or the expectations of those around him. He could choose to fight for something real, something meaningful. But as the words echoed in his mind, his phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with Alice's name. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. The moment when he would have to confront everything he had been trying to escape. "I should answer it," he said quietly, more to himself than to Ngozi. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to. The past is knocking, Jackson. But that doesn't mean you have to let it in." Jackson stood there for a long moment, the phone still buzzing in his hand. The past, the present, and the future. It was all colliding in that moment. But for the first time, Jackson didn't feel like he was being dragged by it. He was standing at the crossroads, and it was his turn to make a choice. He turned the phone off, slipping it back into his pocket. "I'm done with it," he said, his voice stronger now, more certain. Ngozi smiled at him, a quiet, approving smile. "Then let's see where the road takes us." As Jackson took a step forward, a loud crash echoed through the village. He turned quickly, his heart racing. From the edge of the road, he saw a figure stumbling toward him, blood dripping from a wound on their forehead. The figure stumbled forward, blood dripping from their forehead, their movements erratic. Jackson's heart raced as he, "Don't miss out on the next twist in this incredible story. Oughter hit that subscribe button so you never miss an update." If you enjoyed this journey, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, whether it's your city or country. Your thoughts mean the world to us. And if this story hit home, give us a thumbs up. Let's make this community stronger with your voice. Instinctively moved toward them, his gaze shifting between the figure and Ngozi, who was still standing at his side. Her expression now a mixture of confusion and concern. "Who is that?" Jackson asked, his voice sharp with urgency. "I don't know," Ngozi replied, her tone low but tense. "But they're hurt." Jackson didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, reaching out to steady the person as they collapsed into his arms, their body trembling with pain and exhaustion. The person's face was obscured by a hood, but Jackson could see the streaks of blood running down their face. Hey, stay with me," Jackson urged, his voice firm but gentle. He tried to lift their head, but they winced, and their body went limp in his arms. Ngozi stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "What happened to them?" "I don't know," Jackson said through gritted teeth, frustration building. He glanced around, looking for any signs of what had caused this. There was nothing. No sign of a struggle, no indication of where the person had come from. It was as if they had just appeared out of nowhere. "Get them inside," Ngozi said, her voice urgent. "I'll get some water and bandages." Jackson nodded, his mind racing. He carefully lifted the person and started walking toward the small house, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he moved, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary encounter. There was something too coincidental about it. The village, the convoy, the message from Alice. All of it felt like the universe was drawing him back into the life he had tried so desperately to escape. He placed the injured person on the bed inside the house, his breath coming in quick bursts as he tried to process the situation. Ngozi returned quickly, a cloth and a small jar of water in hand. She knelt beside the bed and began to wipe the blood from the person's face with swift, practiced movements. Jackson stood over them, watching closely, his mind still reeling from the encounter. "Who did this to you?" Jackson muttered under his breath, not really expecting an answer. But the person, barely conscious, mumbled something that made Jackson's heart skip. "Jackson, it's your fault." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His heart slammed against his ribcage, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. He leaned in closer to hear, his hands trembling slightly. "What did you say?" The person's eyes fluttered open for a moment, their voice weak and strained. "It's your fault. They know you're here. They're coming for you, Jackson." Jackson recoiled slightly, a chill running through him. "They know I'm here." The words echoed in his mind, and suddenly everything felt too real. The life he had left behind, the empire he had abandoned, the ghosts of his past. They were all closing in on him, and they had found him. "Who's coming?" Jackson demanded, his voice rising with desperation. Who's after me? The person's eyes closed again, and then they fell into unconsciousness, their breathing shallow. Ngozi looked up at Jackson, her expression filled with concern. What does this mean? Who's coming after you? Jackson's throat tightened, the weight of the words sinking in. I don't know, but I think I just got my answer. As Jackson turned to leave the room, his phone buzzed again. He reached for it, half expecting it to be another message from Alice. But when he looked at the screen, his stomach dropped. It wasn't Alice. It was Victor Blackwood. The message read, You can't run from your destiny, Jackson. We're coming for you. Jackson stood still, staring at the screen of his phone. The message from Victor Blackwood was like a punch to the gut. You can't run from your destiny, Jackson. We're coming for you. His fingers trembled as he gripped the phone, and the weight of the words settling over him like a shadow he couldn't shake. The past, his empire, his mistakes, all of it was chasing him down, refusing to let him go. Ngozi stood behind him, watching quietly, sensing the shift in the air. She didn't need to ask. She already knew that this was the moment Jackson had been dreading. What does it mean? She asked, her voice soft but urgent. Jackson didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing. The world he had tried to leave behind was closing in on him once again. The betrayal, the lies, the power, it had all come back with a vengeance. There was nowhere left to hide. I have to go, Jackson said, his voice flat, resigned. Ngozi stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Go? Go where? Back to them? Jackson turned to her, his eyes heavy with a sorrow he couldn't shake. I don't have a choice. They won't stop until they get what they want. And they want me. No, Ngozi said firmly, her voice rising slightly. You don't have to go back to that life. You don't owe them anything. You left. You have a choice now. Jackson's gaze softened, but the weight of the past still clung to him. I left, but they never left me. They think I'm weak for walking away. They think I'll come back because of fear or guilt or duty. But I can't let them control me anymore. Ngozi looked at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite read. Then don't let them control you. You're not the man they made you. You're the man you choose to be now. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Jackson had spent so much of his life running from the weight of his past, trying to outrun the expectations, the responsibilities. But maybe it was time to stop running. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the realization that he didn't have to go back to that life. He didn't have to let Victor Blackwood or anyone else dictate who he was. He could make his own path. He could choose. But the question was, would he choose the village? Would he choose her? He glanced at Ngozi, standing there so grounded, so certain of herself. She had nothing to prove, nothing to hide. She was real, raw, and she had shown him a life beyond the power and prestige of Logos. But could he truly give up everything he had known for a future that was uncertain? Jackson shook his head. I can't. I can't leave everything behind. They'll destroy everything I've built. Ngozi's eyes softened as she stepped closer to him. You don't need that life, Jackson. You've already built something far more valuable here. Peace, purpose. It's not about what you've built in the past, but what you choose to build now. He stared at her for a long moment, her words seeping into his soul. There it was again, the choice, the one thing that had always been in his control. His mind drifted to the village, the land, the quiet mornings, to the goats, the laughter. and to Ngozi, who had made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Jackson turned away, his hand gripping the doorframe of the small house. I don't know if I can just walk away from all of that, he said, his voice quiet. But Ngozi stepped in front of him, blocking his path. You already have, Jackson. You left it all behind the moment you stepped into this village. Jackson's eyes met hers, and the weight of her words hung between them, but this time it felt like freedom. For the first time in a long while, he realized she was right. He had already left that life. The question wasn't whether he could go back to it. It was whether he would let it pull him back. I won't go back, Jackson said firmly, a new sense of resolve building within him. I'm not running anymore. Ngozi smiled, her expression soft and knowing. Then stay. Stay with me. Jackson looked out the window, toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set in a blaze of orange and gold. The quiet beauty of the village felt like a lifetime away from everything he had once known. And yet, it was exactly what he needed. He turned back to Ngozi, his voice steady. I will. I'm staying. Just as Jackson and Ngozi shared a quiet, knowing smile, did the distant sound of engines reach their ears again. This time, it wasn't the convoy. It was a different kind of noise. The sound of a helicopter, cutting through the still air, getting louder by the second. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. Was it too late to escape?